I think most people know how to argue. I say that in quotations, but they don't really know how to argue. I think my argument framework, or how I argue, works pretty well, and so I'm just going to discuss that. I think that one really needs to be aware of the fallibility of their arguments. I think someone needs to be very aware of their ideology and their political consistency before they argue. Because if everyone's ideologies and everyone's beliefs could be put in a Jenga set, you need to know which ones, if you touch, are very soft, or if you touch, they're very sensitive. I know that people have very strong emotions, especially in arguing, but when you're arguing, sometimes we have to put that in the side. So we have to be very much more objective than we are subjective. We can have feelings, but we should still not have our arguments very, all feeling, no logic. We can have logic that has feeling alongside it, because you can't be completely objective. But as much as possible, I think that an argument seems weaker if it's all subjective. I think one has to determine whether the argument is even worth having. And I determine this by assessing who I'm arguing with and seeing their principles. If they have very strong principles that are other than yours, that neither of you will ever concede to the other, neither of you will ever find any agreement, I don't think that's worth having anymore. If it's someone who has no principles and they are just arguing for argument's sake, I also think it's not worth having. If they're clearly just a rage baiter, so that they're just trying to, get some reaction out of you, they're not really trying to get they're not trying to get their mind changed. They just want you to get mad. And I don't know, I guess they get off on it. Arguments with these folk are not really something I willingly do, and so I don't do that. I just don't. It's not worth having. It's not worth doing. So just don't have it. If, however, you can tell that there is some level of intellectual humility, either with you or with the other person, then I think the argument is still worth having there. By intellectual humility, I mean both of you, or at least one of you, is willing to concede to the other in some way, shape, or form ideologically. You can say, yes, I was wrong, and there is something right with your argument. I'm not replacing your view for mine or my view for yours, but I will take what you said into consideration and reassess and modify perhaps my original position, because that is intellectually humble, and I think that's good. But if you don't have it, I also think that it's not really good to have an argument at this stage, because if you yourself are too rigid with your ideals, you're not willing to change them, it's not worth arguing with you. And you should be aware of that. And if you observe that in another, if they are not really willing to concede in an argument, it's also not worth having. But if at least one of you has it, or both of you, ideally, then an argument is still definitely for the go. Definitely worth having. You have to know who you're arguing with. That's why when you're arguing with a stranger, you have to have a lot more arguments, because you don't really know which ones will work for them. But a good thing is that when you're arguing with a stranger, they give input live as well, so you can really assess live what arguments actually are working the best, what arguments they're focusing on. If they immediately go to spamming ad hominem or other fallacies or slurs or insults or just swear words, perhaps this is just not going to be a healthy dialogue, and maybe you should just back out of it. It's not a worthwhile conversation if it's not really a conversation, it's just a rant. I think intellectual humility has to be both ways. And I think civility also needs to be both ways. I do understand, though, that some arguments will never be civil or are not likely to be civil, but I still do think that an attempt has to be made to be civil, even with people you disagree with, because having your beliefs challenged is a good thing most of the time. And challenging other people's beliefs is also a good thing, but some people just aren't willing to be challenged. And if they're not willing to be challenged, it's not worth having an argument with them. It's worth having a conversation with them, perhaps to tell them that they need to be much more humble, much more willing to concede, much more willing to change their opinion. Because if someone's opinions are incredibly rigid already, well, pushing there will make the entire Jenga set fall. It's just not worth it. Everyone loses at that. So, next, you have to know the person you're arguing with, right? I think that was my earlier point, but I got into a tangent and all that. So you need to know what arguments will work best with them, what argument style, what argument needs to contain that would be most effective, because there's no one size fits all argument for all people, because not all arguments will fit on others. So, sorry, my dog's coming in. Arguments. Sorry. Okay, he left. So, arguments with people not worth arguing with, it's just not worth having. And so some styles of arguing works better with some people. For example, if you're fighting someone on a religious point, it's 50-50. Sometimes pushing on their religious beliefs will work. Sometimes it will just not be good. So you really have to know who you're arguing with. I don't recommend arguing with strangers unless you're very good on refining your argument on the fly. And lastly, I don't think you should resort to a lot of these backhanded things that you can do in informal debates. If it's an informal debate, if it's just an argument with just someone somewhere, it's not a debate, I guess you can use these. But to me, I think your argument is just made weaker by having to resort to fallacies and insults and slurs. I think it's just weak. Okay? And it kind of gives me the image that your argument in itself can't convince anyone, so you just have to resort to these backhanded means. It's just not good. It doesn't convince anyone, and it's weak. It's just weak. So that's just my argument framework. It works pretty well. I think I was raised in an environment where you just argue a lot, and it can be friendly arguments, and it can very quickly become not friendly arguments. I realized that having emotion during arguments is a point that's very easily pushed. It's a sensitive area, and so you should avoid going to these sensitive areas. And if you're arguing with someone who will never admit, never say sorry, never admit to wrongness, it's just not worth having. This includes arguments with your family, your friends, and people in general. This is my argument framework. This is just how I argue. So if your framework is different, that's good for you. If it works, that's good for you. But this is what works for me, and it's, to my perspective, very, very effective.